I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. A recent string of shootings in Metro Vancouver escalated to a daylight killing outside a terminal at Vancouver International Airport. Investigators believe yesterday afternoon's death of a 28-year-old man who was known to police is gang-related. An SUV with at least two people inside sped off, and police eventually abandoned their pursuit after someone inside fired at them. A similar vehicle was discovered burning in Surrey a short time later. This will be a relatively quiet week for COVID-19 vaccine shipments, with a delivery of 2 million doses from Pfizer-BioNTech, the only one expected for the coming days. The next shipment of Moderna shots isn't expected until next week, after the drug maker delivered 1 million doses ahead of schedule last week. The federal government has not said when Canada will receive more doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Ottawa has also been in talks with the U.S. after President Joe Biden suggested last month that Washington may release some of its unused stockpile. Canada's top doctor is urging people to maintain public health measures even if they've been vaccinated. Chief Public Health Officer Dr. Theresa Tam is asking people to limit social interactions with people outside their households and to meet with people outdoors whenever possible. Canada's COVID-19 case count reached 1,286,666 as another 6,698 cases were confirmed yesterday. There were 58 fatalities recorded, putting the death toll at 24,626. Some Canadian health experts are pointing to how Britain has managed to turn around after reporting record numbers of COVID-19 cases, deaths, hospitalizations, and intensive care admissions in January. They say the strategy of delaying second vaccine doses to get more first shots into arms worked in the UK and should give Canadians hope. Dr. David Naylor thinks the country will see a significant drop in case counts once 40% of Canadians have had their first shot, which should happen by the middle of the week. Canada's three main political parties are revving their election engines. Even as they insist that they want to steer clear of a campaign, they are already recruiting candidates, training volunteers, and grappling with how to reach voters in a virtual, pandemic-restricted world. The Liberals, Conservatives, and New Democrats all say they have to map out multiple scenarios since the timing of an election is up in the air while the Liberals hold a minority government. The head of the Royal Canadian Air Force is calling on Canada to make it easier to enroll military pilots from other countries amid a critical shortage of experienced aviators. Lieutenant General Al Meansinger says while there has been some progress in addressing the shortage, it has been less than the armed forces and government had hoped for. The Air Force commander says the majority of those who would be interested in putting on a Canadian Armed Forces uniform are from NATO or European countries, but may also hail from others, such as India. The United Nations is asking Ottawa to respond to racism allegations in its treatment of Mi'kmaq fishing for lobster in Nova Scotia. The First Nation has said it has the right to fish at any time for a moderate livelihood based on a decision from the country's Supreme Court. Band members encountered violence from non-Indigenous residents last fall. The UN is considering allegations that the RCMP and Federal Fisheries Department failed to take appropriate measures to prevent the violence, and the treaty rights were not respected. A captive breeding program will be part of a last-ditch attempt to save some of Canada's vanishing caribou herds. A scientific review panel has approved a plan to permanently pen some animals and breed them to repopulate other herds. One of the three herds in Jasper National Park has already disappeared, and the others are down to a handful of animals. Parks Canada suggests the captive breeding could produce up to 20 calves a year. That would be enough to bring Jasper's herds to sustainable levels in a decade. Some large Canadian universities are encouraging students to get a COVID-19 vaccine, but say that they would not require them to show proof of vaccination as they return to the classroom this fall. The decisions from the University of British Columbia, University of Alberta, and McGill University is stirring debate among faculty members. Some say they would feel safer teaching in a classroom full of students if all have been vaccinated. Other schools have yet to make up their minds on the issue. Meanwhile, some Canadian companies are hoping to encourage people to get a vaccine by offering discounts and freebies for customers who have rolled up their sleeves. Insurers, breweries, museums, and tech companies are offering savings and giveaways for the inoculated. Joanne McNeish, an associated professor of marketing at Ryerson University, says it's hard to measure how likely the promotions are to encourage hesitant Canadians to get a vaccine. She says that the deals are a nice perk for those anxious for the jab and one of many convincing factors for others. All right, stay with us. This week, we took a look at the ongoing escalating violence between Israel and Hamas and what Canada can do to help. Our interview with Mr. Avi Ben-Lolo, national award-winning expert in the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, human rights, and Israel, coming up next. Stay with us on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Israel's military has responded to Gaza militants firing more than 250 rockets toward Israel, injuring 6 Israeli civilians. And the number of rockets in the air have been increasing throughout the day. The country unleashed airstrikes on militant targets in Gaza, hitting the high-rise home of a Hamas field commander and 2 border tunnels dug by militants. Meanwhile, Hamas and other armed groups continue to fire dozens of rockets toward Israel. The escalation early today was sparked by weeks of tensions in contested Jerusalem. As the fighting continues between the two regions, a top human rights advocate is calling for Canada and the European Union to stand with Israel. Avi Ben-Lolo says although Canada has released a statement regarding this escalation, Canada needs to denounce Palestinian violence and the injuries sustained by the Israeli police services. Mr. Avi Ben-Lolo, national award-winning expert in the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, human rights, and Israel, joins us now on Forum Daily. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
So can you provide some context for this particular conflict, sir, and what sparked the latest violence?
Look, this has been heating up for some time, and I believe that both Hamas in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, and many extremists in Israel itself have been looking for some kind of excuse to go and to start a mini intifada, if you will. And so it started at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where you had Palestinian rioters start throwing rocks and stones and Molotov cocktails at Israeli police officers and restricting ordinary citizens of all faiths from walking through and worshiping. And so, of course, Israeli police tried to calm down the situation. But that ignited and inflamed the situation even more so. And following that, Hamas saw this as an excuse and a reason to start battering Israel and its citizens with rockets. And the rockets are not small grade rockets. These are very serious armaments that have been deployed and supported and sent to the Gaza Strip by Iran. And they're being now fired. Some estimates are about 600 rockets to date have been fired into Israel, into civilian population centers by Hamas. And as we all know, that is a war crime. It's against the Geneva Convention.
Now, digging deeper into the background of this, we know there are reports about territorial disputes in the Old City. So can you help our Canadian viewers better understand the tension from both sides?
Look, yes, there's always territorial disputes, and Israel has been attempting to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority for many years, as we all know, for over 2 decades, closer to 3, in fact, about setting up an independent, peaceful Palestinian state. The Palestinian Authority has refused all Israeli overtures to have its own state. And the problem with the Palestinians in general in the area is, in fact, they themselves are divided into 2 entities. You have Hamas, and that is occupying the Gaza Strip, and that is a banned terrorist groups. Canada bans this group. America bans this group. It is a known terrorist group that is occupying the Gaza Strip. And then you have the world community is seen as a more legitimate group, the Palestinian Authority, which is in the West Bank. And so they themselves don't see eye to eye. They can't come to an agreement. And both are hostile to the state of Israel and to having a peace agreement with the state of Israel, which is something that Israel wants to do. And so on every occasion, in every situation, you've got these extremists that are trying to advance their cause, launching rockets, violence, terror attacks. There was a young 19-year-old Jewish student who was murdered by Palestinians just last week. And so, it's a really sad situation. And the reason, Canada is a strong ally with Israel. Israel is a democratic state. And I strongly believe that Canada itself and the Western community can deflate the extremism by standing with Israel, and for the extremists to understand that they're on the wrong side of history.
So, what is at risk here if there is no intervention or response by international leaders, sir? About 30 seconds left.
It's going to lead to a war. Simple. Israel is much stronger. Israel, of course, is restraining itself. Hamas is asking for those pictures, that will inevitably end up in the Western media and slam Israel. But Israel will have no choice but to respond and quiet down the situation.
All right, sir, we've got about 10 seconds left, but quickly, is there anything our Canadian viewers can do to add their voices to this issue?
Yeah, look through the bias in the Canadian media. Stand up for Israel. Israel is an ally, a democracy, and is certainly defending itself in this uncalled for attack.
As Canada continues to look for ways to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the country, a parliamentary committee is recommending a national standard for the production and purchase of zero-emission vehicles, otherwise known as ZEVs. In a final report, the committee, tasked with studying how to incentivize the electric vehicle industry, recommends a regulation that would mandate vehicle manufacturers and companies to produce or sell a certain amount of vehicles through the use of credits and set targets. Meanwhile, the federal government says its $300 billion cash rebate program for electric vehicles has been very popular. So is the future of Canada's auto industry going to be fully electric? Well, joining us now to dig deeper into the world of zero-emission vehicles is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Welcome back to Forum Daily, Brendan.
Thank you, Nima.
So let's start with this. What is the attraction around electric vehicles, and what are the economic benefits of investing in such vehicles?
Well, the attraction is both emotional, psychological, status, and the pickup off of a stoplight is unbelievable. So it's a number of different things. With the Tesla and the other electric vehicles that are out there, you've got, it is brand at the moment. It's identifying with your values with the kind of car you drive. This has been going on since cars were invented. People go GM or they're foreign cars or a silver Thunderbird. But this is a little bit special in that if you're at this point in the market buying an electric car, you're making a comment about status and your position on the environment. But I think over the years that's going to change. It takes about 40 years for any technological change to get universal acceptance. It was that way with farm equipment as opposed to horses. It's that way with the personal computer. It's been that way with the internet. So I think it'll be a generational change, but a change is in fact coming.
And it looks like there is a very strong push by officials to do this transition to fully electric vehicles. So Brendan, what stage is Canada at right now in terms of getting to this target?
We bring up a couple of points, and if the subtle viewer would have seen me bite my lip. As we've learned the last year, nothing goes better except that the government manages from a top-down perspective. I really do think this is one where they need to get out of the way because consumer demand, as I think we just talked about, will be over the next generation changing the kind of car people will drive anyway. It's simply going to happen. Like, I don't know, flat screen TVs. At the beginning of the decade, everybody still had the vacuum tubes, and in a few years you looked around and there weren't any to be found. In fact, you bet you couldn't even look at one now without it hurting your eyes. So too with electric vehicles. Over the next 5, 10, 15 years, you're going to see a generational change in the way people choose to drive. That has other implications, which I think government should be looking at, not so much about the kind of car people drive, as though it's their job to decide that, but power grids and systems, as we've seen just in the United States the last few days, that is something of national importance that governments probably should take a look at.
Now, that's an interesting point, Brendan. So we're talking about reducing our consumption of fossil fuels through electric vehicles. But I guess the big question is, where will all this electricity to power these vehicles come from? Are there other industries that would need to expand to support the production of ZEVs?
Well, if you're using Bitcoins to buy your electric vehicle, there's going to be a lot of power required. I think we've talked about on a previous show the fact that the generation of these cryptocurrencies takes a tremendous amount of power. I've heard estimates like it takes as much power as it takes to run Norway or Argentina. So this is going to be yet another demand on the power grid, which was never meant to electrify everything. So we're going to have to put some thought as where the power is going to come from. And clearly, if people don't want to use fossil fuels, the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time, as good as those might be as backup or auxiliary sources of power, we're going to have to look at other options. They aren't making too many more Niagara Falls. So are we going to need to use nuclear? Are we going to use gas? They still burn a lot of coal in the United States. So as much as the green vehicle makes a statement, to generate the power to charge the vehicle is going to take some thought as to where that power is actually going to come from. And it does something to say, well, they'll be charged on the off hours, between the hours of midnight and 8 in the morning. Sure, to an extent. But it is something that, as a nation, we're going to have to spend some time thinking about.
All right, Brendan, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your insight, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Nima.
This past week, the Colonial Pipeline in the U.S. resumed operations after a cyber attack. A journalist in Myanmar was sentenced to 3 years in prison, and Tesla announced they won't accept Bitcoin. More after the break. Stay with us. Israel has pressed ahead with a fierce military offensive in the Gaza Strip, killing as many as 10 senior Hamas military figures and toppling 2 high-rise towers housing Hamas facilities in airstrikes. Meanwhile, the Islamic militant group shows no signs of backing down, shooting hundreds of rockets at Israeli cities. In just 3 days, this latest round of fighting has already begun to resemble and even exceed a devastating 50-day war in 2014. The fighting has triggered the worst Jewish-Arab violence inside Israel in decades. Friday's cybersecurity attack on America's Colonial Pipeline has stricken fear and stress into the lives of people in the southwestern U.S. who have been waiting in long lines at gas stations amid distribution problems and panic buying.
What do you say to Americans who are worried about the supply of gas and rising prices right now?
We have been in very, very close contact with Colonial Pipeline, which is the one area you're talking about where one of the reasons the gasoline prices are going up. And I think you're going to hear some good news in the next 24 hours. And I think we'll be getting that under control. Secondly, I have, in the meantime, made it easier for us to have lifted some of the restrictions on the transportation of fuel, as well as access to the United States military providing fuel and with vehicles to get it there where places where it's badly needed.
Colonial said that it initiated the restart of pipeline operations late Wednesday night, but it will take several days for deliveries to return to normal. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden has signed an executive order aimed at shoring up the nation's defenses against hackers. It will require all federal agencies to use basic cybersecurity measures, like multi-factor authentication, which is already a corporate online staple. The order will also require new security standards for software makers that do business with the federal government. Better software security for federal agencies will likely make internet use safer for the private sector, since many titles are used by both. A military court in Myanmar has sentenced a journalist to 3 years in prison for his reporting under a revision to Myanmar's penal code that critics say criminalizes free speech. Min Nayo is a correspondent for the Democratic Voice of Burma, which has continued to operate despite being banned by Myanmar's junta. The revised law makes it punishable by up to 3 years in prison any attempt to hinder, disturb, damage the motivation, discipline, health, and conduct of soldiers and civil servants. A number of journalists have been detained under the law. A UN Security Council is calling for an immediate halt to fighting in Yemen, saying that only a lasting ceasefire and political settlement can end the 6-year conflict in the Arab world's poorest nation. The council singled out the military escalation by Iranian-backed Shiite and Houthi rebels in the oil-rich central province of Marib. The offensive has put at risk an estimated 1 million civilians. The council's press statement followed a briefing Wednesday by U.S. Special Envoy Martin Griffiths, who said that the Houthi offensive has caused an astonishing loss of life. Muslim leaders from the Xinjiang region have rejected Western allegations that China is suppressing religious freedom. China has been accused of mass incarcerations, forced labor, and forced sterilization in the far western region that has been put under a strict security regime after a series of terrorist attacks. The president of the Xinjiang Islamic Association accused the U.S. and other nations of spreading rumors and lies. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken earlier condemned China for crimes against humanity and genocide against Muslim Uyghurs during the release of an annual report on religious freedom. Electric car maker Tesla will stop accepting Bitcoin as a payment. That's according to a tweet yesterday from CEO Elon Musk, who cited environmental concerns surrounding the cryptocurrency. He pointed to Tesla's concerns about the increasing use of fossil fuels for Bitcoin mining and transactions. The price of Bitcoin fell 5% to $51,847 US after Mr. Musk's tweet. A few months ago, Kenneth Smith was in a chair outside a Texas Outback Steakhouse, hungry and half asleep. A woman leaving the restaurant gave him a $100 gift card to buy dinner. He went in to eat, and the restaurant's manager, Laura Hodges, told him to contact her if he ever needed help. Ms. Hodges eventually hired Mr. Smith at the restaurant, and after posting on Facebook looking for affordable housing for him, the community paid for 6 weeks of a hotel and donated money and other essentials. Mr. Smith is saving up his money for a car, then a home, and one day hopes to have his own food service business. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you next time.